Okay, we should get started in the interest of time. We have a lot to cover in a very little amount of time. I'm Peter Andreas here from the Watts Institute and from the Department of Political Science. I run the security program here at Watson. This panel discussion is part of a series of ongoing Institute events related to the election of Donald Trump. Today we, of course, are focusing on the security implications of his presidency. The news these days, as we all know, is all Trump, nonstop Trump, 24/7, as if the rest of the world doesn't exist. But the rest of the world will present serious challenges, obviously, to the next administration, including in the realm of security. So what are the implications, for example, for military intervention, nuclear proliferation, the status of the Iran deal, cybersecurity, and homeland security, and that great wall that Trump promised us? At this point, we obviously still have more questions than answers, more speculation than real forecasts, but we have some excellent crystal ball geezers here today, all part of the Institute's security program. Jeff Colgan, Tim Edgar, Stephen Kinzer, Catherine Lutz, and Nina Tannenwald, who's rushing over from teaching her class in Bonanno.
What a moment.
Da-da, boy.
Just as she was
Perfect,
announced.
perfect timing. I've asked each to speak for no more than 7 minutes, so we have enough time for discussion at the end. Believe me, they grumbled when they heard about the time limit, but do the math, and we want to leave time for you folks to weigh in and with your questions and comments. I'll start off with just a few comments. Hello. So on. All right.
Cyber war has begun.
I'll start off with just a few comments about the Great Wall of Trump. Now, Make America Great Again was the core theme, one could say, of his presidential campaign. Applied to border security, that means regain control of our borders. It's kind of a nostalgia for this mythical era, which I would say is really about historical amnesia, because to regain control of our borders really suggests that they were ever controlled in the past, which they in fact never were. But that doesn't matter. What matters is you signal your commitment controlling the border, and what better way to do that than something imposing, very visible, very concrete, and call it a wall. And in fact, I would say that build that wall, the rallying cry to build that wall, was quite possibly the single most popular chant at Trump rallies during the campaign. Trump promised a great wall. He even called it a beautiful wall. He said, "No one builds walls better than I do." He's a real estate developer, so here's something very, it was to be his master construction project. Critics were as dismissive of this wall as they were of him as a presidential candidate, but now he's obviously been elected. So what about this wall? What can we actually expect? I'll speculate that he'll not only build it, but it will be a political success story. What do I mean by this? Well, words matter. Here I'm going to say I'm a full-blown social constructivist in the Nina Tannenwald tradition. Whatever is built there, or is there already, Trump will call it a wall. Words matter. What exactly is a wall? A wall sounds like a very concrete, clear thing, but in fact, if you look it up in the dictionary, it's a pretty fuzzy term, what a wall is. In fact, what's already there is very wall-like in some places. What's interesting is that Trump's predecessors deliberately shied away from ever calling it a wall. This is bipartisan, whether Republican or Democrat. No one wanted to use the word wall, except for a fellow named Pat Buchanan, who some of you in the audience may remember from the 90s. He famously ran for president several times, and guess what? One of his key themes was to build a wall. But at that point in time, he was shunned as an extremist, thought of as insulting Mexico, sending the wrong signal to the world, and so on. Trump has actually embraced, he's the Pat Buchanan of the 21st century, in a sense. So he's broken the taboo of calling it a wall and has taken ownership of it, therefore. And in fact, much of the wall, I would say, has already been built for him. There's actually, in fact, been a border building frenzy since the early 1990s. Some of you have noticed, some of you have not, but it's been politically popular to make political commitments to more border enforcement, and the way to do that has been to throw more fencing, more border patrol agents, more military technology, including drones and other surveillance aircraft. In fact, the size of the border patrol doubled in the 1990s, and it doubled again in the last decade. We've used military technologies and hardware that were previously off limits to law enforcement, now applied to the border. We've taken drones that were previously used in the Middle East and now deployed them along the border. So what is Trump doing? He's just taking it to the next level, I would say. He's going to, continue the construction project with his own signature of calling it a wall. And you can imagine the press event with the beginning of his new construction project behind him and, breaking ground. What will happen when his supporters and critics say the wall is still too porous? Well, he'll do the same thing that politicians have done in the past, which is, in my second term, I will make it bigger, longer, stronger, wider. And yes, people will keep digging under it and go over it and around it and so on. Many of them will die. Tens of thousands of migrants have died trying to enter the country in the last few decades. Smugglers have profited enormously from this border construction boom, but it will be a political success story, just as it has been in the past. Thank you. We'll now go in alphabetical order, or at least in the order of the panelists, and Jeff Colgan is next. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Are you going to time us?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. All right. You'll pull me when I need to go.
Tap you.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you. Trump's election certainly has a lot of implications for foreign policy and international security, as Peter said, and many of them are pretty scary. But before we get to those things, I think it's actually important to think about how our foreign policy rests upon domestic politics. And to that end, I want to speak to what I think of as the even larger dangers of a Trump presidency. And that has to do with what's going on with the erosion of democracy, rule of law, and the risk to a healthy media. And I don't assume that everyone in this room has the same policy preferences as me, or even that, voted the same way, has the same partisanship in any way. But I do assume that all of us oppose what I'll call illiberalism. Right? By illiberalism, what I mean is actions and rhetoric contrary to the rule of law, to checks and balances, to democratic institutions, and to the protection of minorities. Donald Trump is a man who has a long history of rhetorically denouncing those things. He, 25 years ago, expressed admiration of the Chinese government for the way in which it responded to the Tiananmen Square protests. He has repeatedly expressed admiration for Vladimir Putin, who's an autocrat leading Russia. He has, during the campaign and even after the campaign, he threatened to lock up his political opponents. And he has claimed since the election that 3 million illegal votes were cast against him without really a shred of evidence of any kind. These are things that should alarm us, even if you felt it was worth casting a vote against an elite in Washington that was out of touch, or that a policy process that embodied by Hillary Clinton that seemed frozen or dysfunctional, what have you. Sympathies, emotions that I could certainly have real sympathy for. But instead, what I woke up with the morning after the election was a real nauseous feeling in the pit of my stomach. I think many people did. And I think that feeling was there for a reason. I don't want to have the emotions I had in the first 48 hours where I just was in a fog for 48 hours, but I do want to keep some of the emotions that were there around resolve and around activism that are going to be really important in the next 4 years in the way that America responds to what is very likely going to be some actions that seek to increase the power of the presidency and that delegitimize political opposition to those moves. The question I think I want to put on the table for us to think about is how to distinguish between two different trends. One is a trend towards presidential power consolidation that's been going on for quite a while, that President Obama did, that President George Bush did, et cetera, taking actions that increase the power of the White House relative to the other elements of the US government. And contrast that against steps that a Trump administration might take that are actually of a different nature, different in kind, in the way that they undermine the democratic institutions of this country. And I think the key thing to recognize is what we're talking about is not necessarily a return to mid-20th century fascism. The question is not whether Trump is comparable to Adolf Hitler. The real risk is much more subtle than that. Today's autocrats keep the rhetorical commitment to democracy. They keep the window dressings of elections and voting, and yet they undermine simultaneously the more fundamental social practices that make elections meaningful. And so consider how Putin undermined democracy in Russia, or how Hugo Chavez did it in Venezuela, or Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. They did it gradually. They did it slowly. They certainly did not roll out the tanks in one big event and have a real attack on the way things go. Instead, I think we ought to consider 10 signs of creeping illiberalism or democratic erosion. These are 10 signs that political scientists have put together. These are not 10 signs that I put together because this is not my area of research expertise, but I've been sort of boning up on this topic because I think scholars and even concerned citizens have a real obligation to know more about this. So here are 10 signs that we should be thinking about as potential things in the future. Media intimidation and restrictions. Second, identification of crises or political paralysis that justify emergency measures by the executive. Third is attacks on minorities and scapegoating of foreigners. Fourth is closing of space for civil society, especially funding restrictions, legal cases, raids on NGOs, et cetera. Fifth is a rhetorical rejection of the current political system, a discourse shift. A sixth is the expanding the size of courts or other bodies like electoral commissions to stack them with partisan judges or other officials. Common move in other countries. Seventh, modifying rules to impose or eliminate term limits on officials, especially election officials. Eight, a weakening of the legislature or intimidation of legislators. Ninth is the silencing of political opposition, and 10th is a significant increase in internal security forces. Now, the key point to keep in mind here is that if there were good, reliable indicators of democratic breakdown, then the breakdown itself would be unlikely to happen. Right? Breakdown mostly happens when it is unanticipated and supporters of a democracy fail to mobilize against it. So, what have I got, 2 minutes?
Nope.
Okay.
30 seconds.
Okay, all right. So if you're interested in more, Steve Walt wrote a great piece on foreign policy, and there have been others that I urge you to consider. My main message on this is that we need to prioritize about what we're going to see in the next 4 years or 8 years. I would not argue that we should be focused on policies, much as that climate change is near and dear to my heart. I've sort of accepted the fact that that has to be a lower priority than more fundamental concerns around governance and rule of law in the next 4 years. So I will stop there before I really get the hook, and be happy to speak more about this in Q&A. Thanks.
Tim, you want to speak from here or go to the
It might be a little easier to speak from here.
Sure. Great.
Can you hear me fine from here, or I'll go up there if that's better?
Just pull your mic over.
Thank you. Thanks. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what Trump calls the cyber, and to say a little bit more about it than he did, which was mainly confined to the cyber is so big. I agree with that. I think the cyber is so big, so I think this is one where Trump and I agree. And first I'm going to start out with putting aside, you know, this was the cybersecurity election in many ways. So the 2016 election involved hacking of emails by John Podesta and the Democratic National Committee, WikiLeaks, the first example really of a foreign power directly or indirectly interfering in U.S. elections in a way that the U.S. is usually on the other side of in terms of other countries. And I don't mean to be snarky in saying that. I actually mean that it does make it more difficult for us to object on a principled ground to propaganda operations directed against us. I want to put a little bit of that aside for now, because I think we would have been talking about that a lot more if Hillary Clinton had been elected than if Donald Trump is elected. And the reason is Trump is going to be the president, and he's going to set the agenda. One commentator after the election said that when you look at Trump's kind of outlandish way of talking, that what you saw was the reaction of two different kinds of people, that people who were opposed to Trump, and especially more educated people, took him literally, but they did not take him seriously, and that people who were his supporters took him seriously, but they did not take him literally. I think that's a mistake on both counts. I think we need to take him both seriously and literally, and I think that we're in the process of starting to do that, and that is maybe part of the reason for Jeff Colgan's feeling in his pit of his stomach. I know it was for me. Now, Jeff also talked about Trump's admiration for Vladimir Putin. Masha Gessen, who is a longtime journalist and critic of Putin's, who has now left Russia to come to live in the United States, had an excellent article about this in the New York Review of Books called Autocracy Rules for Survival, basically saying here are some things to keep in mind when you're looking at whether somebody might become an autocrat. Her very first rule was believe what the autocrat says. I think that's an extremely important rule to keep in mind. In other words, take what the autocrat says seriously and take it literally. When somebody tells you what they're going to do, assume that that is what, in fact, they want to do. So I decided to take Masha Gessen's advice in a couple of pieces that I've written recently about the election. One is called, well, I forget what they're called, but one is from the Christian Science Monitor about closing the internet up, and another is for the Century Foundation, and it's called Turnkey Tyranny. So I want to talk about those very briefly. Starting with turnkey tyranny. Ed Snowden talked about the idea that, okay, all of you people who defend the NSA, like you, great Tim Edgar, maybe it's under control now, maybe we have rules of law, there's a FISA court, there's privacy protections, but what happens if somebody else is elected? It'll be like turning the key. These capabilities are just too scary to put in the hands of a major government agency. I disagree with that for a number of complicated reasons I don't have to go into, but I think he has a point. There is, in fact, a key here. We are talking about policy that could be undermined. I wrote a piece in which I explain ways in which Obama might make it more difficult for Snowden to do that, and in fact already has, by reforming and opening up surveillance in a way that we haven't before. But I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that it's done the trick, that we have a tyrant-proof intelligence community. We have a lot of professionals that care a great deal about the rule of law and have been trained on things like Executive Order 12333, which guarantees privacy protections. But those are policies, and they could be eroded in important ways, and we need to be looking out for that. My second piece, which is perhaps a little bit more provocative, was about shutting down the internet. And what I said here is looking at something Trump said actually more than a year ago. He said, we're losing a lot of people because of the internet. We have to talk about, maybe in certain areas, closing that internet up in some way. He also said he would want to call Bill Gates to ask his opinion. Now, this got a lot of wry smiles and amusement from people who took it literally but not seriously among the educated class. A lot of fodder for late-night comics. Look, Trump is an idiot. He thinks you can call up Bill Gates and Bill Gates will turn off the internet. I think we need to take it seriously. You're talking about lots of countries that Trump says he admires, China, Russia. They close the internet up in important ways. It isn't a technically impossible thing to do. It may be more difficult in the United States, but there are certainly ways to do it. And what's more, if we think that our Constitution and laws will prevent such a crazy autocratic idea from going forward, we need to take a close look at those laws. Some of them are on the books from a long time ago, emergency powers. After 9/11, we saw how they could easily be resurrected by President George W. Bush. This is a different example, but it could be done in a similar fashion. Section 606 of the Telecommunications Act of 1934, this is the same law that allowed Roosevelt to seize communications, allows perhaps Trump to do the same thing when it comes to the internet, and I explain why. Now, Jack Goldsmith, who is a law professor at Harvard Law School, has said, don't worry about all this because there's so many checks and balances built into the system, and especially in the wake of things like the Snowden revelations, there's so many eyes on the president, this couldn't happen. And I have to respectfully disagree with him, and the main reason I do is, although I actually agree with him about all these checks and balances, I think he's ignoring the Trump factor. He's ignoring the possibility that a president may not just may not care about how things look, may not care about an inspector general report that's embarrassing. How would Trump have reacted to the Abu Ghraib photos, for example? That's an example of checks and balances that helped us to reform some of the excesses in the war on terror that Jack Goldsmith talks about. So I think we need to take Trump both seriously and literally, and I've started to try to do that in those two essays.
Right on time. Stephen Kinzer.
Thanks. It's great to see you all here, and another example of what Watson has to provide this community, which is a wonderful thing to be a part of. Uncertainty is the real central reaction that we have when thinking about Trump and foreign policy. We really don't know what he said, and the few things that he said that I've liked, he has also contradicted in other things that he said. So we're still waiting. Now, one of the things we're waiting for is still to find out who's going to be our Secretary of State. And I think you could argue either way. This could be something really important because since Trump is not an expert on foreign policy, except for watching the shows, maybe he would like to listen more to people around him. Therefore, who he picks will be even more important than it might have been for other presidents. You could also make the opposite argument, though, that he already knows what he wants to do. He doesn't care what those people tell him, so he'll just put them in for window dressing. That would actually follow a tradition in which foreign policy has been pulled more and more into the White House. So it wouldn't be anything radically new. Therefore, it's still uncertain not only who the Secretary of State will be, but whether that will matter at all. Now, Trump enters the presidency at a time when the United States has had nothing but a string of foreign policy failures. Every single one of our major strategic goals for the 21st century has been a failure. We did not manage to contain North Korea. We did not contain China. We did not contain Iran. We did not make friends with Russia. We did not calm down the situation in Eastern Europe. We did not resolve the Israel-Palestine problem. We have not stabilized Iraq. We have not stabilized Afghanistan. We have not calmed down militancy in the Middle East. So he comes in with a real losing record. The two realities that face the United States now are, first of all, at least relative decline in our power. We're not going to be as powerful ever again as we were in 1970 or 1980 or 1990 or 1995. That's something we just have to accept. That's a reality of the world. And another piece that leads to is more than ever we're going to be a need to rely on partners, on allies, and not the way we used to. We've always had alliances, but they're alliances that we dominate. Our partners are not real partners. They're subservient. That doesn't work anymore. We need to have partnerships that are on a more equal basis. So these are two huge psychological adjustments for the United States. To adjust to the fact that other countries are getting more powerful and that at least the relative power balance in the world is changing. And second, we have to use diplomacy and compromise more, even with the people we want to get onto our side. the appointments we've seen so far lead to reasonable fears of military dominance of foreign policy, and the militarization of foreign policy has been one of the great trends of recent American history. Trump's approach to diplomacy also sounds very troubling if it's going to be based on the approach that he used to business negotiations. Business negotiations and diplomatic negotiations are completely different. In a business or legal negotiation, your goal is to triumph. You want to get absolutely as much as possible. If two lawyers are fighting over a pot of money, the one that gets the most is the big winner. If you can get 95%, that's an even bigger win. But diplomacy is not like that. In diplomatic negotiations, you only get success when everybody walks away from the table feeling that they got something. Trump has never been involved in that kind of a negotiation. So this requires a shift in tone and approach that having military men making foreign policy doesn't necessarily guarantee. If Trump really wants to drain the swamp and make America great again, his real challenge in foreign policy is to end our foreign wars. De-escalate the wars we're in, not start any other ones. Now, that debate has really not begun. And I fear that although I had some hope, as Peter Andreas said, that in foreign policy at least Trump would be the Pat Buchanan of the 21st century and really pull America back from empire, I'm not sure I see that. Actually, I see the debate continuing more or less as it has been. That's why people like those you see in front of us are not part of this debate. Because the debate is, essentially, we've decided to drive our car off a cliff. Should we wear seatbelts or not? We don't want to participate in that discussion. We want to say, wait a minute, maybe you shouldn't drive the car off the cliff. But the debate has not been widened to that level. And I'm hoping that it will, but I'm not optimistic. Now, when it comes to ending wars, what specifically have we accomplished with this election? I think we reduced the possibility of war with Russia. I do believe that Hillary Clinton's anti-Russia militancy could have spun out of control. I don't think she would have started a nuclear war with Russia intentionally, but tensions are so high right along the Russian border and in Eastern Europe that given attitudes and prejudices on both sides, that was a very dangerous situation that could have spun out of control. So I think we dodged a bullet on Russia with the election. But Iran becomes more likely as a spot for war, which is almost as bad, although at least Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. Let me just read you a couple of quotes from some of our new public officials. Here is our new Secretary of Defense, General Mattis. Iran remains the most single belligerent actor in the Middle East. It is the single most enduring threat to peace and stability. Hoping that Iran will become a modern, responsible nation is a bridge too far. And I love this one. Iran is not a nation state. Rather, it is a revolutionary cause devoted to mayhem. If you believe that, it would be pretty irresponsible to leave it all alone. So I see that we are increasing the possibility of conflict with Iran. Here is our new national security advisor. Iran represents a clear and present danger to the region. Regime change in Tehran is the best way to stop the Iranian nuclear weapons program. Evil does not recognize diplomacy. If that's true, then what's the point of negotiating at all? And the Iranians have picked up on this as well. Here is the Supreme Leader. Our problems with the U.S. will not be resolved if we retreat from our position on nuclear program. They will ask us about our long-range missiles. After that, they'll ask about our support for Hezbollah and Hamas. Then they will pressure us to support human rights the way they do. If you back down about all of these, they will ask, why is our religion mixed with our government? Then they will ask us why Iran is such a large country with a large population. The Americans will never let us alone. There's some basis for that. And we have a serious problem emerging in Iran. 6 months from now, there's going to be a presidential election. When Bill Clinton came in as president of the United States, the Iranians responded by electing Mohammad Khatami, an open-minded reformer. When George W. Bush became president of the United States, the Iranians responded by electing Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. After Obama came in, the Iranians responded by electing Rouhani. Now we have Bush. 6 months from now, there's another presidential election. We could have this spiral down into a situation where Iran also has a leader who wants a confrontation between Iran and the United States. So what I'm hoping is that on day one, President Trump arrives in office and says, I'm announcing a new partnership. It's going to be Russia, Assad, and us, and we're going after ISIS. That's it. All it would require from us, besides the psychological adjustment of working with Putin, would be to pull back from our demand that Assad must go. But other than that, it would be a way for us to break out of some of our strategic paralysis, and that might be a way for us to begin thinking in new ways about the rest of the world. So that's my hope for what he might do.
Kathy Lutz.
Can I, oops, is this gonna work? Whichever's closest. Both of them, there we go. My job was to talk about the military budget under Trump, what could be expected there, and I think I appreciate all my colleagues' reminders that we really all should have our hair on fire about the prospects of what's to come in the next 4 years, particularly in terms of that question of these basic democratic principles that Jeff was talking about. So in some ways, to talk about Trump and his so we could expect from his the military budget that he would propose is a little like asking about about expecting there to be a normal sort of set of political processes that go on for the next 4 years. The irrelevance of fact to a lot of what he's done through his campaign and what we can expect going forward, I think, also suggests that I can present you with lots of facts, but we won't necessarily be seeing those as as really very much involved at all in the political deliberations about what happens. We'll expect more to see spectacle and political efficacy of that spectacle be the determining sort of factor. But in general, I think Trump sold his candidacy in part on being tougher than his predecessor. He had a lot of contradictory things he said about being less interventionist, and having a concern with the size of the military budget. But now it's clear that he intends to raise the military budget. He claims it's in sharp decline, and I'll come to this data in a minute. But mostly he's been calling for an increase in spending to boost particularly elements of the military that are not relevant to the fight against terrorism. He's been calling for increases in various kinds of military hardware for the Air Force, the Navy, in particular, more ships, more troops for the Army, all very, very expensive items. Just increasing the Army, the amount that he wants is projected to cost $35 to $50 billion for the first term. $22 billion is expected to be the price tag for what he's called for in terms of increasing subs construction. But a recent article by Bill Hartung, a military spending expert, suggests that despite all these sort of large ticket items adding up to much more than this, that in fact politically what's most likely is that he would come in at around $90 billion a year more for the military budget. Even this, of course, makes no fiscal sense. There's magical thinking around what he claims for where this money is going to come from in terms of cutting into waste and fraud at the Pentagon, which people have been saying for decades and not succeeded at making even a dent in. But certainly military industry stocks took a huge jump news of his election. They had been steady state tracking the S&P and it suddenly jumped up and have stayed up there. His appointment of the variety of generals or prospective appointment of these generals also bodes well for the military being seen as the primary tool of American foreign policy, even more so than it is now. Again, this is General James Mattis, Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, again, both men with records of quite extreme statements on and provocative statements on on America's relationships with others. General Petraeus, General John Kelly, Admiral Mike Rogers, all of whom, again, are possible candidates for again, a range not just of national security or Defense Department related positions, but even for State Department. And this, of course, is a threat to the notion of the civilian control of the military. We've had generals before in those kinds of positions, but quite rarely. And in fact, what we can expect to see here, I think, is much more military, the Pentagon determining when and how we deploy and how we allocate budget dollars. And again, this is all based on the simplistic argument that more Pentagon dollars means more security. The other thing that Trump asserted during the campaign was that America's allies have been free riding on our security spending. That one of the ways he'll be able to afford a bigger, stronger, more muscular, more masculine, macho military is by having these leeches get on the program and contribute more money. But in fact, we can, if you look more closely, which Trump has not, at the actual deals that the United States has made with our allies around security spending, for example, Japan, 75% of the cost of U.S. military bases in Japan are paid for straight out by Japan. The other 25%, again, paid by the United States, but even that doesn't account for the Japanese security spending, which, as an ally of the United States, should be counted in some sense in the U.S. column as a security asset. And it certainly doesn't account for the fact that to call that U.S. spending in Okinawa, for example, a gift to the Japanese is to disregard the fact that the United States is there because it's putatively in the United States' national security interest to be there. And again, we're talking about billions of dollars. Japan is now spending billions to relocate U.S. Marines from Okinawa to Guam. There's story after story where, again, the money that's being spent for the U.S. or in sort of theoretically joint interests, but again, with one powerful partner and one subordinate partner, despite the fact that things are becoming more less unequal than they have in the past, we still have unequal terms of exchange when these funds are being pulled together. The United States still is in some ways setting the agenda more fundamentally. And one of the things I wanted to point out is that as we look forward to the debates that are going to happen in Congress under a Trump administration and a Republican Congress, there are many ways to fool most of the people most of the time about military spending, and I just want to point out a couple of them. One is to ask about the U.S. military budget as percentage of GDP. As the Heritage Foundation here in this slide shows us, that will suggest that we've been in a steep and dangerous decline in our spending. If you look, however, at the actual inflation-controlled dollars, you can see that our national security spending, or at least this is Pentagon spending, has been in very sharp growth, and these lumps for the war fighting should not mislead us to think that this is a decline. Of course, we've been withdrawing from Iraq and Afghanistan. But again, this is like the GDP argument is like saying, I have a $100,000 income, therefore I should spend $30,000 on a car, and even if my transit goals can be satisfied some other way, and even if it's especially insane when the argument's made that I should do that because my neighbor who has a $50,000 income has just spent $15,000 on his car, so I need to keep up with him by spending more as a percentage of my income, right? It just makes no sense. What is your goal? You're trying to be mobile, right? What's your goal? You're trying to be secure. That should be the first question. Okay, so another thing you can do, if we go forward another slide. Do I don't have the, Peter, can you just advance it?
Do we have control of it? Okay.
All right, well, anyway, okay. Again, this is relative. One more slide forward. The other thing you can do is pick your time frame, right? If you go back to the whole 20th century, you see, again, a very slight change. If you take a more narrow time frame, things look precipitous and dangerously, again, in decline. So watch your axes when people present this. You can also, you should also fail to compare Pentagon spending with other elements of domestic spending. So people don't do this GDP argument with education spending, where the United States is at number 58 in terms of spending on education as a proportion of GDP. And you should also just use the Pentagon budget. Don't use the whole national security budget. You would be over $1 trillion if you took the whole national security spending range of spending. With the Pentagon budget, you're down closer to $600 billion, right? So huge difference. So in the end, I think we can expect Trump's military spending choices to have the same profile as his choices so far. There'll be a populist, nationalist, white nationalist, masculinist appeal to his call for various kinds of national security moves in spending and in strategy. He's going to claim to have a bigger, badder military with more men, more equipment. One quote from him during the campaign was, "I'm going to build a military that's going to be much stronger than it is right now. It's going to be so strong, nobody's going to mess with us. But you know what? We can do it for a lot less." So again, he's going to be the smart businessman. But again, we can. The reality is going to be like the recent move with the carrier company, which is to say, there'll be a spectacle of change in the direction that satisfies the populist, white nationalist, masculinist audience and fans of his administration. The spectacle of bringing jobs home that we're going to go overseas. But the reality will be, and as it was with Carrier, a little bit different, $700,000 being spent in state tax incentives, in other words, state tax money, payer money, to keep these 1,000 jobs, basically bribing Carrier to keep those jobs in the United States. I think in the realm of military spending, we'll see that Trump will stand in front of in Groton, Connecticut, at the General Dynamics, and he'll talk about how many jobs are being created by his additional spending on the Navy, but he will be, in fact, creating far fewer jobs with that spending than he would have with education or other spending. Which, one more slide forward. Economists who've looked at 2 more slides, sorry, forward, 3, there we go, have shown is actually just not at all a reasonable way to, the military budget is not a jobs creation program. It shouldn't be just on principle, but it certainly isn't in economic reality either, where $1 of military spending creates far fewer jobs than $1 of infrastructure spending or educational spending and so on. So stop there.
Thank you. Last but not least, Nina Tannenwald.
Thank you. All right, my focus is nuclear weapons and the Iran agreement, and a little bit on Russia. So I'd like to start with what Trump has said on nuclear weapons. So during the campaign, he said a number of times that he thought that the biggest problem in the world today is nuclear proliferation. And so he has repeated that. But he has also said that he thought maybe Japan and South Korea should be allowed to get nuclear weapons. So those 2 statements would contradict each other, because that would represent proliferation. He's also said several times that I would be the last one to use nuclear weapons, but he wouldn't rule it out. So he said nuclear weapons are last resort. He would not want to use them. He would be the last person to use them, but he wouldn't rule out their use. And in that, he is completely consistent with all past presidents. No past president has ever up front ruled out a use of nuclear weapons. Now, there are different ways to talk about how likely you are to do that and to suggest what your attitude would be. But in that sense, in that regard, he's completely consistent. The issue of the image of Trump with his finger on the nuclear button, though, has been something that has rattled some people, include Hillary Clinton, who said in her speech, accepting the Democratic presidential nomination, quote, "A man you can bait with a tweet is not a man we can trust with nuclear weapons." So when Trump takes office in January, he will have sole authority over more than 7,000 warheads, and there is no fail-safe in this system. So The whole point of the U.S. Nuclear weapons control is that the president has sole authority, sole decision to use them. Only the president can use nuclear weapons, and whenever he decides to do so. Now, the Secretary of Defense could oppose this decision, but then the president could fire the Secretary of Defense and just get him out of the way. And then there is a long sort of chain of command, and there are codes and so on. But in the end, the only way to prevent a President Trump or any other president from launching a nuclear attack is to elect somebody else. So there is no stopgap, right? There's no formal fail-safe system here. That does leave some people sleepless at night. I'll come back to the issue at the end of the issue of when a president poses a national security threat. Modernization of nuclear weapons. So this is undoubtedly an area where Trump will push forward. So there's a current U.S. plan under the Obama administration to spend about $3 trillion modernizing the nuclear arsenal. The Obama administration has argued sort of implausibly that this is a necessary part of disarmament, that these weapons need to be updated. And there was likely, in a Democratic administration, there would be likely have been cuts in these modernization plans in various ways. This is one area that will clearly go forward. There's lots of Republican support for modernization of all three triads, three parts of the triad of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. Trump is in favor of this. There are people in the Pentagon who are in favor of this. This is, a huge expenditure that is part of this whole story of the military budget. So that will undoubtedly go forward. I think relations with Russia in this regard, especially in the nuclear issue, is one of the potentially positive aspects of Trump's planned foreign policy, to the extent that we can know it, that could be. So we do need a reset with Russia. U.S.-Russian relations are at an all-time low, and the hard-won U.S.-Russia security cooperation relationship, the nuclear security cooperation relationship that's been built up since the 1970s, has basically been totally dismantled and unraveled. And we are now in a situation where you have this increasing salience of nuclear weapons in the U.S.-NATO relationship in Europe that we haven't seen since the end of the Cold War. Russia is saber-rattling. There's buildups on both sides. The U.S. is putting missile defenses in. It's really worrisome. Obama and Putin had a terrible relationship. There's a potential here for Trump. Trump says he wants to make nice with Putin. So there's a potential for improving that. We do need to work with Russia on Iran, on Syria, on many things. So improved U.S.-Russian cooperation would be very important. The Republican hawks in the Senate do not like Russia, will not like this. And so if Trump wants to go this route, he's going to be fighting with his own hawks in Congress over this. And the Pentagon is quite also anti-Russia. But there's no arms control going on. There's almost no security cooperation. So this is an area where potentially Trump, the change in the Trump attitude might be welcome. Okay, finally, the Iran agreement. So Trump said numerous times on the campaign trail that he wanted to tear up the Iran agreement. He's now chosen a Secretary of Defense and a CIA director who are both very anti-Iran, very hawkish on Iran, and very critical of the Iran agreement. The Republican Party platform rejected the Iran nuclear deal as binding on the next president, right? It takes the form of the executive agreement, which means in principle it's easier to undo because it's not a treaty that the Senate signed on to. So there is potentially support for throwing this agreement out. In fact, I think this will be quite hard to do. In part because it's a multilateral agreement. So it involves the European countries and Russia. And they care a lot about this agreement. The European allies care a lot about this agreement. There's a lot of countries doing business in there. Sanctions have been lifted. If the United States says, oh, we want to renegotiate the agreement and get stronger terms and put more sanctions on Iran, the European allies are unlikely to go along with that. And the sanctions, the reason we got the Iran agreement in the first place was because the sanctions were multilateral and everybody put on sanctions. U.S. unilateral sanctions aren't going to have the same effect. One reason that it's really not to our advantage to undo the Iran agreement right now is because the United States has basically met its obligations under the Iran agreement, that is in terms of lifting sanctions against Iran, in repaying Iran frozen assets that we have from arms sales from a long time ago. And so we've sort of completed our side of it, most of it, and so the only thing that would happen here is that Iran would be allowed to walk away, right, without the monitoring that the UN provides. In reality, I think what's going to happen, so even Israel, which was very opposed to the Iran agreement, Israeli security officials are now saying, don't throw it out, it actually provides security. What will really happen in the Iran agreement is that Trump and the Republican critics of the agreement will try to hold Iran to the absolute letter, the terms of the agreement. So what they're unhappy with is that Iran is a little bit nickel and diming some of the requirements, a sort of gray area violations, really hard to figure out. The Obama administration has tried to smooth those over. Trump will not want to do that, and his advisors, Pompeo and Mattis, will not want to do that. They will want to, every single little nickel and dime violation, they will go after and hold Iran to those. They may try to fix some gaps in it, which involves missile testing, which is not really part of the JCPOA, the joint agreement, but they would like it to be part of the commitment. So I don't think that's going to disappear, but there's going to be a lot of politics around it, and I do agree with my colleague Stephen that there's much more hostility to Iran, and this is an area where if the agreement should disappear, then we are really in a very serious potential for an escalation to conflict with Iran.
Thank you, Nina.
Stop there.
Okay, we're
Before we
almost
go
on
to the
sch-
questions, let me just make one announcement
Right.
that for those of you interested in Iran, we are having one of the Iran nuclear negotiators, who's an Iranian diplomat, former Iranian ambassador to Germany, speaking in this room on Monday at noontime, Hossein Mousavian. So if you want to see, he's a person very tied into the Tehran mindset. He knows exactly what's going on there. This will be a great moment and a very authoritative voice. And I encourage you all, if you're interested in Iran's perspective on this, to come on Monday at noon.
Perfectly timed talk from this topic. We've covered a lot of ground. We're almost on time. We have wide open for questions. Please indicate
wanna
in
collect
your
a
question who you are asking the question to. We can go till 1:30.
Do you want to collect a few? That way.
Yeah, collect a few questions to make it efficient. Start here.
So this is a question for Timothy. Just as a quick background, I almost took over Tor, which is an anonymity software that is used by dissidents in repressive regimes. As a result of this, I got targeted for a cyber attack on my home network, and pretty much discovered that the offensive capabilities of cyber far outweigh the defensive capabilities of cyber, and there's a little chance that your average person or industrial company could defend against the 0 days that are being used and the automation that's being used. I talked to some friends who ran DARPA war games about this, and they agreed. So the question is, in a realm where Trump is offering warnings against companies for offshoring jobs and is threatening political opponents, is there any hope for Fourth Amendment protections to stand when the slightest suspicion can just obviate them in a FISA court?
Let's take a few more questions.
My question, I guess, is for any of the panelists, and it is, what do you think the perceived or real potential impact would be of a loosening of libel laws on a free press, particularly when media outlets are already under tremendous financial pressures, so that we won't have as many embedded journalists because we're too busy paying out to people whose feelings got hurt for something that was written. And how are we as a country supposed to be an alert citizenry if we're not getting as much news, or we're getting a different kind of news?
One more question, then we'll take it to the panel.
Thank you. It was really a brilliant panel, and I don't think a word was wasted, so that things were not talked about should be of no surprise to anybody. But I was surprised in the discussion of place, geopolitical faults, and the actual international relations, that the word Ukraine never came up. And it seems that Ukraine will occupy a crucial place in whatever negotiations are undertaken with the reset with Putin, and in the name of perhaps the renunciation of American empire, as Steve was hoping for in a deal with Putin to save Assad or to crush ISIS. Where does Ukraine sit in? And there'll be a huge discourse around this, and in the name of watching and tracing how that discourse plays out, the discourse will be that Ukraine is essentially still the borderlands, a place of unrestrained ethnic hatreds, on a base that produces a failed state, and anything that is done to stabilize it, federating it, or once again subjecting it to direct Russian control, sort of is called for. And what I want to say is the word Ukraine literally means borderlands. We used to say the Ukraine. Ukrainian independence since the 90s has been built around the idea that we are no longer the borderlands, and we reject the article the. And the civil war that has been taking place within and around Ukraine is actually being fought in Russian, meaning Ukrainians who speak Russian and Ukrainians who speak Ukrainian are, that on both sides of the conflict, the major and most interesting discussions are in Russian.
Okay, so, I think Stephen might be the best person to start with that question, but Tim, do you want to actually
Sure.
start with the cyber
Yeah, I was
question?
going to say that the cyber, the is not supposed to be there either. I think we all know
Do
that.
my Trump impersonation.
Exactly. So, yes, so your question really goes to this issue of libertarian panic, which is something Jack Goldsmith accused some of us of involved in. But he accused us in a very odd way of saying, you're all involved in a libertarian panic, and that's great, even though it's false, because that's the way in which we make sure it doesn't happen. And so basically what he said is, I don't think Trump is going to go back to abusing civil liberties in this dramatic fashion, but I think the fact that you think I'm wrong about that is part of the reason that that's going to happen. I'd say the glass is now more half empty than it is half full, but it's still only half empty. We do have laws and protections and controls. The FISA court exists. All of those things exist. And the question is, how much do they get pushed by a Trump administration? And we don't really know the answer to that. But his general attitude towards surveillance gives us pause and cause for serious concern. I'd say there's a couple places to watch out for. One is that next year, Congress is supposed to renew the law that allows for PRISM and upstream collection to go forward. That's Section 702 of FISA. So the debate over that renewal will cause Congress to rethink some of those surveillance powers. And the other big area is encryption, where we've seen Trump, again, very much on the side of the government, saying that he wanted there to be a boycott of Apple products because of their refusal to cooperate with FBI's request to unlock an iPhone. This is one of those terrible ironies where in Silicon Valley, I think people's heads just couldn't get their minds around a Trump presidency, and so they were all focused on Clinton. They were all focused on, why isn't she better on privacy? Why is she saying these weak things about this and that? And they never really stopped and thought, well, what's going to happen if she loses and Trump wins?
Okay, let me try to address a person who knows much more about this subject than I do. So, I think the Ukraine problem is part of the larger problem of European stability. I don't believe there's going to be a stable security architecture in Europe unless Russia is involved in it. Now, what should be the policy of Europe toward Russia? Should it be more confrontational or should it be more compromise-oriented? There's quite a debate going on among European countries on this subject. Some, like the Baltic states and Poland and Britain, want to be more confrontational. Others, like Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Italy, France, want to be less confrontational. Now, right now, Europe's taking a more confrontational policy because we're paying the bills, and we want a tougher, more confrontational policy. I would tell my friends in Ukraine, take a look at the recent history of Honduras. Honduras is a little country that's living next to a big giant. Honduras had a government a couple of years ago about 5 years ago now, the United States decided we didn't like. So we allowed the military to overthrow it. Secretary Hillary Clinton applauded that. Several members of Congress went down to Honduras and thought it was great. And the president was put on an airplane in his pajamas and thrown out of the country. Now we got the regime we liked. Things haven't gone so well in Honduras. It's one of the most violent countries in the world and has many other problems. But we got the regime we wanted. And Honduras and other countries in that neighborhood have had to live with the cruel reality that the Westphalian ideal has to be adjusted to power realities. Now, what does that mean for Ukraine? Here's my interesting solution. Remember the Austrian State Treaty back in the 1950s? There was a question of whether Austria was going to be in the east and the west. There was a lot of debate. There were a lot of occupying troops still in there. And a guy who I don't have much regard for, John Foster Dulles, negotiated a great treaty in which Austrian neutrality was permanently guaranteed. I like to see something like that as a model for Ukraine. I just don't think it's right for the United States to expect that Ukraine should be a Western European and pro-NATO ally and Russia not react.
All right, Jeff, you want to say a few words about illiberal?
Yeah, I mean, the libel law possibility, I think, is one way in which you could imagine the free press in this country being bullied and intimidated in the next few years. I think that the things that we ought to be concerned about are that, but also a couple of other things, right? So one traditional tactic by populist leaders is to develop their own channels of communication with the populace, right? So that Hugo Chavez had his own like weekly television show. He would go on for hours at a time, sing songs, do all kinds of things, but it was a way of kind of continually connecting with the population. It may be that Trump is happy with his Twitter account and that's doing enough for him, but it is certainly possible that he decides to build his own Trump network television, which was kind of an idea floated even prior to the election, and then he moves in that direction. Another possibility is to really keep an eye on Fox News. There are at least signs in which Fox News is starting to resemble a state-run news organization. Not that it actually is state-run by any means, but it becomes a mouthpiece for a set of interests that are really striking in that they are very coordinated in the way that they develop messages, right? And this has been true of kind of right-wing media for a long time, but it takes on a completely different dimension to it with Trump coming into power.
Can I just follow up on that? What do you see as different about what
Can you speak in the
Fox-
microphone?
What do you see as different about what Fox News is doing now as in comparison with the Bush era, where clearly they had a very strong pro-administration?
Yeah, I need Dan Nexon here, who's actually been posting on this recently, writing about this, about how you can almost track the ways in which Trump will make a statement and Fox News will corroborate it, and these are often statements that are actually completely false, right? But Trump will make a statement that's totally false, and then Fox News will report it as fact because Trump said it. And the various ways in which they sort of working back and forth. And I can't give you good examples off the tip of my tongue, unfortunately, but I do think there has been a shift.
Okay, Dietrich.
I may be wrong, but I think neither of you addressed the question of what might happen in Europe in part as a consequence of Trump's win, such as how Brexit is treated, how the France elections will come out, and how he will or should react to Poland and Hungary and so on. In other words, the European Union may fall apart. It's quite serious possibility if any of those things happen. It may not fall apart, partly because of Angela Merkel, but she may not be saved from the next immigration from the Middle East. But so I think it's important to, in your predictions, to go to what changes in Europe might mean for the new administration.
Hi, this is not so much a question, but just an explanation, because Peter saw me kind of start laughing when Stephen mentioned Honduras. Now, Ukraine has nothing to do with Honduras. Ukraine has nothing, Russia's relations with the U.S. have nothing to do with the U.S. foreign policy towards Russia. They have everything to do with what's happening in Russia internally. And to say that somehow the Obama administration, you know, alienated Putin, that's not what happened. Putin invaded Ukraine. To say that Europe is being confrontational towards Russia, it's not what happened. Russia attacked a neighbor and violated the European order post-World War II. So to say that, and the United States had nothing to do with it, other than the United States has a certain principles such as respect for international borders, which the United States isn't shy about asserting. So that's my 2 cents. It's not a question. But I just wanted to say, you guys thinking that this has anything to do, oh, and the Trump, now the fact that Trump is friendly with Putin is good news because it's going to stop us from having nuclear war with Russia? No, it's actually going to make it more likely that Russia is going to be encouraged in continuing this behavior and unleashing nuclear war with somebody else. And I think it's really bad news that Trump is friends with Putin. But you may or may not want to respond to that. It's not a question. I'm sorry.
It is a question if you basically ask someone on the panel, to, what do you think of what I just said?
Two things about the Ukraine. One is not.
We should.
Two things.
We need
Okay,
to
yeah,
pass
but
the-
one, just that the crisis in Europe and the alignment of Putin with illiberals in Europe as part of the project to fracture Europe is wound up at the hip with the problem of Ukraine. So the two things have to be held together, Steve.
We need to take another question before the panel.
Thank you. Hi. My question is for Jeff and Timothy in particular, I think. You mentioned that obviously we have the consolidation of power at the president's hands, but there is another trend of consolidation of news and information in the hands of the information technologies, in the hands of Facebook, in the hands of Google, and so on. And these industries are, you know, they are California, Silicon Valley. Obviously, they don't like Trump, and so I suppose the question is Trump going to have some kind of an internal war with these entities that are starting to control so much of the news, of the public knowledge, public opinion, and what is this kind of an internal war could look like if it does happen?
Okay, plenty for the panel to chew on and digest and pontificate about. So let's start with Tim.
Sure, thanks. Yes, I think that's right. I think that Silicon Valley and Trump are on a collision course on a number of issues, on surveillance and privacy and encryption. You go down the list. Silicon Valley is used to having an ear with President Obama and his administration. I think they're in for a very rude awakening, actually. I don't think they realize just how much influence they actually had over the administration. And I think that, you know, one way in which we're going to see this play out is over this controversy over the so-called fake news, which is, you know, obviously there was in fact fake news. We know this is documented. Propaganda, either directly by the Russian government or inspired by, in some cases, Russian pro-Russian groups in Eastern Europe. And the call has been, well, Facebook has to do something about this. Well, this is a very dangerous proposition. Facebook now is supposed to be in the position of being an editor of news, and yet it is a legitimate question to ask, because it turns out that a large number of people get their news from Facebook, which means they get their news from what friends post on Facebook. It doesn't mean they get it from Facebook. And Facebook exists as a company precisely because they don't produce this kind of content. So I think that this is an example where illiberalism could be a big problem, where Mark Zuckerberg may feel like he needs to curry favor with Trump in some fashion that could be very dangerous for internet freedom. And yet at the same time, I think you're absolutely right to point out this enormous clash, this sort of cultural clash, because there would probably be a massive revolt from Facebook employees, from Silicon Valley, from programmers, if it looked like something like this was happening.
Can I just add, and I think you're putting your finger on something very real here, that I think information is going to be one of the key battlegrounds in the next few years. And I'll just say two things about that. One is that the unhappy marriage between capitalism and democracy has its greatest friction point in the media, right? So the media is trying to serve two masters, and it never does it very well, right? It has to satisfy a bottom line, which means providing entertainment primarily, versus also trying to provide the information that is essential to democracy, right? And that's a public purpose versus a private purpose. And the media always faces a difficult choice about which one of those to serve, and lately it's been serving one much more than the other. The other thing to say is that we are really already seeing a change in the availability of information, of unbiased statistics that is really important. And I want to call attention to the fact that Kansas, the state government of Kansas, has been running a conservative experiment over the last 4 to 6 years, where Senator Brownback came in, eliminated the income tax, wanted to do a bunch of major changes, and promised that this would lead to great economic growth. It's led to terrible economic outcomes, and the way they've dealt with bad economic news is by banning the publication of state statistics about those economic outcomes, right? So they've eliminated the statistics as a way of dodging the bad news. And that's the kind of information warfare that I think we're going to see more of in the next little while.
Down the line.
Yeah. So I will respond. I will take this as a question. I want to push back a little bit. I don't always take a realist viewpoint on things, but I do have some realist genes, and those realist genes think that great power relations are important. And I think the United States is not blameless. Let me start out by saying I think Putin's a thug. I think, Ukraine is absolutely wrong. What Russia is doing in bombing civilians in Syria is absolutely wrong. It's abominable. At the same time, there is a longer backstory here about the failure to reconstruct a European security order after the end of the Cold War that included Russia, right? And so Russia has a long list of grievances here about NATO pushing eastward and sort of not taking into account Russia's kind of interests. And now the United States has pushed ahead with missile defenses in Eastern Europe, which it insists are not targeted at Russia, that they're targeted at Iran. They're to defend against Iranian missiles, but Russians don't really believe this, and so they feel like they're surrounded. So, there's some long-term failures of imagination, in my view, failures of imagination having to do with the missed opportunity to reconstruct a broader vision of a European security order after the end of the Cold War. That being said, that's partly how we got to where we are now. And so I think the immediate explanation for the bad relations right now is what you say, right? It's Russian aggression. But I do think that great power relations are important. And we need Russia's cooperation on a whole bunch of things. And, we do not want the U.S.-Russian relationship to be the place where nuclear war breaks out. The Obama relationship with Russia is down, down, down. We don't know what Trump will do, and he's got opposition from his hawks who won't who are very anti-Russia and won't want to make nice with Russia very much. So it's very unclear what will happen, but there's a potential there for improving relations that could actually have some benefits, both in terms of nuclear cooperation and cooperation on other security issues like Syria. Dietrich's question about Europe, I mean, that is a fantastic question. To me, that's kind of the deep risk, right? We can think about, there's policy issues that Trump might pursue. I think there's issues that we might call deep risk. One deep risk is how the intelligence community thinks about national security threats when the president and his top advisors are potentially national security threats. That is how these people, their ability to handle crises or emergencies or so on, right? The second deep risk is the fraying and the unraveling of the European Atlantic order. And we're in the position right now, interesting historical development, where the major upholder of the post-war liberal order, whatever you think of it, its good points and its bad points, is Germany, right?
Yes,
The leading democracies, the U.S. and Britain, are pulling themselves out. That leaves France. That leaves Britain.
Yeah.
France and Germany.
Kathy?
I think it's interesting. A number of the questions so far have been about freedom and the impact of the Trump administration on our sort of sense of what the natural order or the democratic order of things should be. But I think what's going to be harder to see and harder to resist is the impact on the political economy of our security. So looking at the redistributional effects of the choices that the Trump administration makes about where to spend security dollars. It's going to be it's a massive effect, right? When you talk about this amount of money, this kind of increase in the military budget, you're talking about, again, fundamental changes to the way in which people are employed, how much they make, where wealth accumulates, and for the military budget, it tends to be white male labor that benefits, right? So there's going to be a massive redistribution from women to men, from across racial groups, right, to whites. And again, this was part of his appeal, and he can, but probably won't point to that, right? He'll say this is good for everybody. But I think those are some of the questions that we're going to be, I think, wanting to ask ourselves as much as these questions. And one of the things, though, one of the ways in which it will come up, although I think this is a very limited part of the problem, is in terms of Trump's businesses, right? People are saying, okay, his foreign policy is going to follow his business interests, right? He won't divest. He will meet with people, as he already has, who have interests, and people are already sort of piling into his hotels in Washington, his hotel in Washington, to curry favor and so on. So I think those are as important as some of these strategic questions we might have about, how he should, what kinds of choices he should be making.
Stephen and then Tim. But Stephen, do you want to? Your comments were Ukraine relevant, even if you didn't actually explicitly say Ukraine. And if you have any thoughts on Dietrich's comment about the future of Europe, that would be interesting as well.
I do think Europe is in a real crisis of confidence now. It's very distressing. I would like to see that relationship, the transatlantic relationship, strengthened, but not in a military way. I'd like to see us more involved in a political sense, not determining security policy for Europe. When we talk about the rights of individual countries and how that plays out in real life, I think about this. So we were involved in a project aimed at pulling Ukraine into an alliance, which, if we had succeeded, would have allowed American nuclear weapons to be right on Russia's border, as they are in some parts of the Baltics. Now, if Mexico were to make an agreement with the Russians to open up a base in which nuclear weapons would be placed in Tijuana, Mexico, under the principles of national sovereignty, would have every right to do that. But we would never tolerate it. We would bomb that base, as well we should, because we couldn't tolerate such a threat so nearby. So those are the difficult calibrations that big powers and small powers have to make.
Okay, well, I wasn't planning to address Ukraine, but I really can't let that go by. We were not involved in a project. The Ukrainians elected a new government. The new government said they wanted an association agreement with the EU, had nothing to do with NATO. So Russia attacked Ukraine because their favored government was thrown out of office by, well, they didn't elect a new government. I think Stephen will probably correct me on that, so let me correct myself. Their government was driven out by a popular uprising because of its corruption, and Russia was upset about the fact that their crony government had been thrown out. And so then they annexed a major part of another country in violation of their treaty commitments. So, I think the idea that Trump's election is going to somehow make that all go away because now we're friendly with Putin is just nonsense. I mean, it's a huge, massive crisis. It continues to be a huge, massive crisis. And it's not happening because of anything the United States did. It's happening because the Ukrainians did something that the Russians didn't like, and they tried to push them around. Now, it's true that we try to push around Latin American countries all the time and have in the past, but that doesn't necessarily make it right for Russia to do it to their near neighbors.
Did we have an assistant secretary of state handing out chocolate chip cookies to demonstrators
Okay,
and
so-
telling them, go overthrow your government?
So the fact that Newland was stupid enough that her PR person told her it was a bad idea to be openly siding with demonstrators does not mean that we were the reason that this government fell. The government fell because the Maidan was occupied by a popular movement of nonviolent protesters. Anyway, I wanted to say something else, and I'm sorry because I want to. This is too difficult. I wanted to basically just ask Nina just to tell her that maybe this will be comforting to you about the fact that nobody can stop Trump from pushing the button. I counted 3 ways that he could be stopped from pushing the button. The first is an outright refusal by the military because it would be a war crime. So, if Trump woke up tomorrow and decided, let's just nuke Putin, I've decided that I've changed my mind about him, they would refuse that order because it's clearly a violation of the laws of war, and they would be right to do so even though the president gave them that order. That would in some ways be a little bit of a coup d'etat, so it would be a constitutional crisis. Second thing is there's the 25th Amendment. So Vice President Pence could get together with, as long as he gets the vote of half the cabinet, they could declare him incompetent, and he could become acting president. That is, in fact, a constitutional way to remove the president from power. Again, it's a bit of a constitutional crisis because it's never happened before, and people kind of wonder, what if the president starts saying, hey, I'm not incompetent, but under the words of the Constitution, it's actually quite clear what the procedure is. The vice president convenes the cabinet. As long as half of them sign a letter and send it to the Speaker of the House, he becomes acting president. And then, of course, there's impeachment, although I think that impeachment would probably not work to get his finger off the button because it would take too long. But those are the 3 ways I count. Now that's not very, comforting, I think. I think those are all kind of, a little bit doomsday-ish scenarios. But it gets back to the broader point I was making about this kind of libertarian panic. I think it's actually a useful exercise to go through this panic and to think about, oh my God, this might happen, what would happen as a result, because I think it makes it less likely to happen.
Nina wants to jump in before
Can I just respond on that? So I think the major stopping point would be the firing officers who say, I'm not going to fire nuclear weapons because this is potentially an illegal order. So we actually have a case. So there was a colonel who was a decorated Air Force pilot in Vietnam who was then positioned in a missile silo. That was going to be his posting. And so he asked, before his job, how would he know if the order to fire was legal or not? And for that, he was demoted from his position. He did not get the job. He was demoted. He was kicked out of the military. So for asking that question.
Well, he might have been demoted for asking the question, but they're all trained that you can't obey an illegal order.
That is true, and it's actually a very important issue that I think should get some attention in the current times.
Dietrich has 2 things. I would say just note, the best and most interesting panels, I hope you agree, are the ones where the panelists don't always agree with each other. That's a good thing. Dietrich has a two-finger. We also have time for maybe one or two more questions to conclude the session. But Dietrich, you want to jump in?
Question, just a comment. Several people said, Timothy was the last one, we had nothing to do with the Ukraine. It's not true. The Ukraine's integrity was guaranteed by Russia, the United States, and Great Britain. And neither of them remind us of it. And the fact is that was not an agreement that the Senate approved, but it was still. Three governments agreed on the integrity of the Ukraine, including that vacation place from Moscow.
So I wanted you to take me seriously, but not literally on that point. Obviously, we have a lot to do with the Ukraine. We have important relations with Russia, with Ukraine, everything else. My main point was that their political change in the case of the Maidan was not some CIA plot. That was my main point.
Let's take two more questions and then some concluding thoughts from the panel.
I was thinking in terms of Ukraine, how many nuclear weapons are
We
there?
have some hands up on that.
How many nuclear
Zero.
weapons are present in Ukraine presently?
Zero.
None.
Zero. I mean, it used to,
Guaranteed the Ukrainian borders in exchange for Ukraine.
If they had nuclear weapons, they never
Yeah.
would have been
Right.
invaded by Russia.
Let's get on to
Okay.
other topics.
but they did prison.
That's why it was a mistake.
Interesting thing is that none of the panelists mentioned Ukraine. You're totally right about that, but the discussion certainly has turned that way. Ukraine arguably regrets not keeping nuclear weapons after the end of the Cold War. Let's take two more questions, and then the panelists can have a final say.
Yeah, I'm curious as to why there wasn't much discussion about China, unless there's no security implications to China. One of the countries whose economy has been most challenged by candidate Trump, of course, is China because of the trade. The article I read in the Atlantic by Jeff Goldberg, I think, the interview with Kissinger talked about the potential of conflict between the U.S. and China over trade. Certainly, if Trump makes good on, if we take those promises literally, then we're going to have some kind of a confrontation with China. Is it my conclusion or that correct that the panel doesn't think China is a security issue for the U.S.?
One more question.
Yeah, my question is more domestically focused, or maybe internationally. I mean, I think it's clear that Trump is not going to be able to accomplish half of what he said, potentially. And so internationally, that might be a good thing, that he can't accomplish what he's saying. But domestically, does he anger a population that's already pretty angry? And instead of them being able to march pitchforks to the White House, we see people turning on each other because of proximity. One of the things that I've noticed on my Facebook feeds is, the number of people who are sending me all sorts of notices about how many black people have now started buying guns. Now, of course, when you read about it, the people who are sending it to me are talking about how the inner cities, and when you read about who's buying guns right now, it's people with college educations. People like me sitting in this room have more to fear now than we thought we should have. So I'm really concerned that, maybe internationally he's not going to be able to do a lot of damage, but he is going to do so much damage internally that we won't have to worry about international threats. Not to be depressing.
All right, final thoughts of my fellow panelists on either of these questions or comments.
Well, let me just respond to two of them. First of all, on China, you're right, that was an egregious omission on our part. I don't think the United States has any vital interests regarding Syria, even Iran. I'd argue that what happens to Ukraine is not a vital interest to the United States, but China is. China is a very serious foreign policy challenge to the United States, and I would argue it's the greatest foreign policy challenge we've ever faced. We have never had a situation like this. We've got a country that's coming that's bigger than we are, going to be richer than we are, more populous, long tradition, a great regional leader over many centuries. We're not prepared for this. And China is assertive. China is feeling its strength growing. I do see a potential for conflict there. I don't see it as immediate and volatile as the situation in the Middle East. But over the long run, if trend lines continue, I do see a possibility of serious conflict with China. And the one comment I would make about the illiberalism is essentially to agree with you. Frankly, so far, I'm not angry at Trump for statements that he's made or bad policies that I think he's going to follow. But the one thing that it already really frightens me is that some people who are Americans are afraid to be Americans and to be the people they are and walk around on the street and be who they really are inside. And that's really bad. So I agree with you that our greatest contribution to global stability would be to build a society at home that would be a model for others. And we're going in the opposite direction.
Can I?
Nina?
So on the China issue, I think it's useful here to look at the position, the views of the advisors. So the incoming Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor Flynn, and the CIA director. So these, to the extent that Obama had a pivot toward Asia, sort of, there's a debate about that, it's going to focus back on the Middle East. And already, these guys are really obsessed by radical Islam. And so Flynn is really a self-declared Islamophobe. And so they're going to be looking at Asia through the lens of jihad, of Islamophobia. And there are already statements to that effect. So Flynn has said something like, you know, we have to be watching China and North Korea for their connections to global jihad, all right? So that is the lens in which they are going to now interpret our Asia policy. And these are at least two of the three top advisors take this Islamophobic view. So that's the lens through which foreign policy is going to be conducted, including Asia.
Can I?
Sure. Oh, Kathy, go ahead.
I appreciate the last question because I think it really does direct us back to think about the way in which all these politics are local politics, right? And I think one of the things that we have to be alert to, and again, Jeff and Tim in some ways gave us this sort of list of things that we should be alert to. That should include this notion that the Trump administration will turn on particular domestic audiences or fractions of the population, as he already has during his campaign, at any crisis moment internationally. And so that the flag burners will become suddenly, again, and also all over Fox News, as a way of diverting attention from the enemy without becomes the enemy within. So I think, keeping care on that. And also thinking about the university's role and the ways in which a panel like this can, under autocratic states, become a criminal act, right? To even speak these words. Right? And this is something that we also need to be really vigilant about and assert our right to continue to speak and to not self-censor.
Tim, your final comments?
Sure. I can't resist pointing out that it's pronounced Gina. But yes, here's where the cyber is so big is actually probably correct. I think I fault myself for not discussing the China issue, but this is an area where a real cyber conflict perhaps is more likely to happen than virtually anywhere else. And part of the reason I think that it may be true is that when you look at Russia and its offensive cyber activity in the past year, it was directed essentially to help Trump get elected. That may or may not have been their purpose, but that certainly was the effect of it. So I don't know that the Trump administration is going to be focused too much on going after Russia for its offensive activity in the cyber realm. Whereas with China, the focus of its cyber activity has generally been industrial espionage. And when you look at Trump's economic policies of trying to bring back, the great industrial manufacturing of the United States and having a sort of hyper-nationalist view of the economy. This is a competing, we have competing countries, and if they're winning, that means we're losing, and if we're, this kind of win-lose proposition, he's going to react, I think, very, very strongly to Chinese industrial espionage and view it as kind of a direct assault on the United States. So, maybe the chances for a cyber war have gone up with China if they, may or may not have in a way that we really haven't thought about.
Okay, Jeff?
Great. Three things. One on your comment, I absolutely, share your concerns, and I think that in a sense, the thing that we can do most as individuals is to fight fear, right? And one of the things that we can do in a university setting is to express solidarity and to have events and to make sure that we are reaching across our usual lines and make sure that we are supporting people who are in fact threatened now in a way that they weren't previously. I never thought that Harry Potter would actually have personal lessons for our society, but it turns out that maybe fighting fear becomes a real one, right? The second thing is just on China. I do think that trade wars are a real possibility. And in fact, I wrote 2 days ago in the Washington Post a long column about why I think Steve Bannon and Trump's economic team are moving us back towards a world in which we reenact Smoot-Hawley Act of 1930 that led to the trade wars of the 1930s and the political upheavals of the 1940s, which is obviously a very, very dark prospect. And so hopefully that doesn't come to bear with respect to China, but if his moves towards China are even half as damaging as that, it would be kind of immeasurably bad for the U.S. and for the world. Last thing is that you called attention to China. I'm amazed that we have got to the end of this panel and nobody said North Korea. And so, in terms of security threats, one can point to a lot of kind of blinking red lights around the world, and we haven't talked about that one, which I think is a real concern.
Stay tuned. Thank you so much for coming. We're over time.
Thank you.